I'm in South Africa, the beautiful and unique land where I grew up. It's a land of sunshine, good food and wide open space, the latter meaning that the car is king when it comes to getting around. This presents a potential problem to South Africans. If you want any sort of realistic mobility here, you need to own a car. Public transport does exist, but it's slow, uncomfortable and unreliable. And as the average monthly wage here is only about £900 per month, with many earning a lot less, this means that there is an insatiable appetite for ultra-affordable vehicles. Motorbikes don't really work here. They're too small for long-distance trips or carrying multiple passengers, so small, reliable, cheap cars are the way to go. Enter one of South Africa's most remarkable success stories. After Nando's, that is.
This is a Citi Golf, which is a curiosity relating to South African motoring. Basically, it's a Mk1 VW Golf, and basically they decided to keep it running, even though they did actually bring out the later versions of the Golf here as well. But they kept the Mk1 Golf as a budget option and renamed it the Citi Golf. And it turned out to be one of South Africa's most popular cars. Today you still see hundreds of them on the roads. And really the reason being that they are simple, straightforward, easy to drive, good on fuel, and above all, cheap. This particular Citi Golf that I'm driving now has done 259,697 kilometers, which is quite an impressive amount. Admittedly, it's done mostly long trips because my parents live out in the countryside and they use it mostly for driving to the mountains where they do mountain guiding for work. But nevertheless, you can still see that's a pretty impressive number of miles, and everything is still original on this car. Engine, gearbox, the lot still as it came out of the factory. So you can see they are pretty reliable. So I think really the reason why the Citi Golf has endured so long is because it incidentally is probably the perfect car for South Africa. Firstly, it's very cheap and easy to maintain. Spare parts come cheap. The cars are easy to work on as well, so you can get a pretty basic bush mechanic and probably get it running again pretty easily. The suspension, being quite old, is quite soft and compliant, so it's ideal for South Africa's poor road surfaces. And also the replaceable components like tyres and shock absorbers and that sort of thing, which wear out pretty quickly, are also very cheap to replace, so the car isn't expensive to run. You compare that to a lot of modern cars which have quite specialist suspension components. The tyres are often a specialist size for that car as well. That really quickly becomes unworkably expensive if you are running these cars every day on poor road surfaces. It was only really tighter emissions controls and also safety standards that really killed it off eventually in the 2000s, because it just became the car was just too old to uphold the new safety laws that were coming through. Other than that, I think the car would continue to be built today really if it wasn't for that, and they still have a very active second-hand market and still see them everywhere. So it just proves they are probably one of the most popular cars in the whole of South Africa.
Time for some history. In the late 1970s, the South African Volkswagen production line in the Western Cape finally got the upgraded tools to start producing the Mk1 Golf as the replacement for the much-loved but ancient Beetle. The new Golf was popular, and because more than half of the 5,000 individual parts for it were manufactured locally in South Africa, it was cheap too. Sales figures soon outstripped those of the preceding Beetle. But then, in the 1980s, VW began phasing in production of the Mk2 Golf. There was a large investment in new tools and training, and this, along with the more advanced features of the new car, meant that the list price was considerably higher than its predecessor. This put it out of reach of a large segment of VW's South African customers. The most obvious solution was to start producing VW's smallest car, the Polo, as well. But the high cost of setting up a new production line meant that the Polo would not be cheap enough, and additionally, many South African customers demanded cars with 4 doors, presumably after being subjected to clambering in and out of the back of a Beetle for 30 years. The next suggestion was to produce a stripped-down Mark II Golf, but even if pretty essential items like the passenger sun visor and the tailgate struts were removed, the cost savings would still not be enough. The solution, it seemed, was obvious. They already had all the tools for producing the Mark I Golf, why not just keep making it? Obvious though it might seem, it was still a radical decision for the time. Would people want to buy a drab, old, outdated design when there was a fresh new version of the same thing also available? VW gave the concept to their marketing team, and the solution they came up with was to aim the economy Golf at the urban youth market. Make it fun, hip and funky, give it some sex appeal, make it into a cheeky, consumable 80s fashion statement to contrast it against its more serious grown-up brother. And thus, the suitably hip and urban-sounding Citi Golf was born. Because cities are urban and misspelling is cool. It was a pretty brilliant bit of marketing, and South African buyers lapped it up. For the next 25 years, the Citi Golf reigned supreme as the coolest new car for young people, despite going up against competition 10 or even 20 years fresher in design. The Citi Golf became the motoring equivalent of a pair of jeans. Other fashions could come and go, generations could pass, but it still remained a functional and stylish item which could be toted equally by both the young and the old without fear of being sniggered at. Long after the Mark II, Mark III and even Mark IV Golfs had been put out to the pastures, fresh, cheeky new Mark I Citi Golfs were still rolling off the same production line as their predecessors 30 years earlier.
So what's it like to drive? Well, unsurprisingly, it feels like driving a Mark I Golf. Basically, the only real difference is the engine has been slightly updated over the years. But all the running gear, the suspension, the steering, it's all straight out of the Mark I Golf. So really that's what it feels like to drive. By modern standards, the gear shift is a bit slow and a bit vague. It is fairly easy to select the wrong gear if you're not paying attention. Steering is pretty heavy. There's no power steering. I think power steering was an option, but this particular car does not have any power steering. So at low speeds, that can get a little bit heavy, but once you're on the road and you're out and driving, it actually feels very nice. Lots of feedback from the road. The suspension is pretty soft as well by modern standards, so it soaks up the bumps pretty well, but it also means that it does roll a bit on the corners if you are pushing it. But really these cars are not designed to be pushed. The engine is willing but not lightning quick, and as are the rest of the car basically. It will get you where you need to go and it will get there reliably, but it's not a sporty car, and really was not designed as such. So don't expect GTI type performance from this, because really the suspension and everything was just from a bog standard VW Golf, or as it was in the States, the Rabbit.
For a car that was produced for a total of 41 years, from 1978 to 2009, the number of design changes were remarkably small. The first was an extra L-shaped indentation on the C-pillar, which is actually there to add more rigidity to the structure. Then there was an updated front grille based on the styling of the Mark II, along with larger moulded bumpers and, on later models, the dashboard from a Skoda Fabia, and more modern rear lights. Early Citi Golfs had a 4-speed gearbox and a 1.3-litre 8-valve engine with 65 horsepower, originally designed for the European Polo, although a 1.6-litre sport option became available later in the 1980s. During the 90s, most of the range was given the 5-speed gearbox, although the 4-speed was still retained on the most basic model right up to the end of the decade. The engines were gradually upgraded to a 1.4-litre carburetor engine with 73 horsepower, a 1.4-litre fuel-injected model with 84 horsepower, a 1.6 litre fuel injection with 100 horsepower, and a range-topping 1.8 litre fuel injection with a mighty 122 horsepower, the fastest production Mark 1 Golf ever made, and pretty terrifying when you consider that ABS was never an option. In fact, all you have to stop you landing in a hedge, or more likely in South Africa at the bottom of a cliff, are some 1970s disc brakes at the front and drum brakes at the rear. Airbags? Ha! In the last few years, if you were very lucky, the driver might have one, but sorry for you, passengers.
So you can see that with the engine, they've just gone for a very basic, straightforward approach. This engine is actually pretty much identical to the original engine that was in the Golf / Rabbit. I think there have been some minor changes to the head, but as far as I'm aware, it's pretty much still how it was in the Mark 1 Golf. You can also see some signs that this was originally a left-hand drive car. For example, the brake servo, which you can see here, is on the passenger side. And what they've done is they've just run a long pole, basically, from where you put your foot down on the brake there to where it actuates the master cylinder there. So rather than try and shift things around, which wouldn't have really worked with the engine layout the way it is, they just found a pretty straightforward, novel solution. So inside, the theme of simplicity is continued. Dashboard is pretty basic. You have your general heating controls, straightforward radio. But other than that, there's no bells and whistles. I think you could have air conditioning as an option on some of these cars, but I don't think the base model had that as an option. Space is not too bad. There's a reasonable amount of space for front passengers, but unless you pull the seats forward, the rear seats are a little bit on the cramped side, and the boot is not the biggest either. But you can fit a couple of reasonable sized suitcases in there, so you could do a decent sized road trip with 2 or 3 people. So this is not a luxury car by any means, but it's certainly comfortable enough, and it has a certain charm to it which I think you just don't get with modern cars these days. These sort of economy boxes which are just designed to be as cheap as possible and only last for a few years before they get replaced. This has a real sort of longevity to it. You feel like you could own this car for a good number of years and everything would just continue to work as it should do. And that really is the experience that most owners tend to have with these cars. I mean, they do go wrong, things do happen, but the great thing about it is that, the cost involved in having that replaced is pretty negligible compared to what you would have to pay for a modern car. So really, it's not surprising to see why these cars are so popular in South Africa, and I think that probably could have been echoed around the world if it wasn't for more stringent regulations in Europe and America, which meant that these cars had to be phased out in the 80s. VW has always been a popular brand in South Africa, but really it was the Citi Golf, I think, that really established their place as probably one of the leading players in the market. Oh, and look at that, here's another one right next door to us.
VW couldn't have known it at the time, but their spawning of the Citi Golf would set a trend among South African car manufacturers. Once the likes of Opel, Toyota, Ford, Mazda and Nissan saw what could be done with some old tools in a hungry market, they quickly began churning out their own versions of old model budget cars, aimed primarily at those funky youngsters. We got the Opel Kadett Cub, the Ford Laser Tracer, the Mazda Sting, Toyota Tazz and even the Nissan Champ, a 1960s Datsun pickup design which was produced virtually unchanged until 2008. Even today in South Africa, you can still get yourself a Polo Vivo, a Ford Figo or a Toyota Quest, all of which are budget options based on previous generation models. But none of them could ever quite manage to pull off the same panache as the Citi Golf, and that's really because they just weren't as good to begin with.
One thing that struck me about these cars is that I mentioned earlier that they do feel a bit dated now compared to a modern car, especially in terms of the gear shift and the steering, etc. But you have to remember that this is a car that was designed in the 1970s, and actually when you think about it, compared to other cars that were being designed and built around the same time, this car feels remarkably modern and up to date, really. And considering that it's had virtually no design changes since then, that's a pretty remarkable achievement, in fact. And I guess that's why they could continue running it for so long, because it actually was so far ahead of its time that it managed to keep up with even more modern cars that came out 10 or even 20 years afterwards.
It's easy to dismiss the Citi Golf as just a multinational corporation's desperate attempt to flog second-rate cars to a low-income population. But the Citi Golf became so ubiquitous and well-loved that it's as much a part of South African culture now as biltong, boerewors and Table Mountain. As a local motoring journalist put it, virtually every South African has had one parked on their driveway at some point. Today, a new generation of young middle-class South Africans can do better and demand more from their cars. So it was inevitable that the Citi Golf would eventually fall by the wayside, especially with today's safety and emissions regulations. But the Citi Golf's legend and influence on South Africa lives on today and will continue to do so for decades into the future. These cars remain as well loved by South Africans as their own families. And, like their families, South Africans love and accept the Citi Golf for what it is, for better and for worse.